I watched him with a quiet fury as he packed his bags, whistling to himself as if this were just another business trip and not the demolition of our 3-year engagement. From my position in the doorway of our bedroom, my bedroom, in my family's historic estate, I observed how carefully he folded his designer shirts, the ones I'd gifted him from the profits of the investment portfolio he didn't know I managed. Harrison Reed, soon-to-be hospitality executive, soon-to-be ex-fiancé, and completely unaware that his entire future had just imploded. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. So you're really doing this? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Canceling our wedding with 2 weeks' notice because Olivia suddenly decided she wants you back? Harrison glanced up, his handsome face arranged in that patronizing expression I'd grown to despise. Emma, we've been over this. What Liv and I had. It's complicated. When she reached out, I realized there were unresolved feelings. It wouldn't be fair to either of us to go through with the wedding. Unresolved feelings. How clinical. How convenient. What he meant was, his college sweetheart who'd dumped him for a London banking career had returned to Boston, newly single, and apparently willing to reconsider the man she'd once deemed not ambitious enough. And you're moving in with her? Today? I pressed, watching him zip his luggage with an ease that suggested he'd mentally checked out months ago. Her family's townhouse in Beacon Hill has plenty of room, he replied, not meeting my eyes. It makes sense financially while I transition to the new position. The new position. Another detail that made this betrayal especially rich. Harrison didn't yet know that the prestigious hotel group that had recruited him, the career advancement that had suddenly made him worthy in Olivia's eyes, was a recent acquisition in the Blackwell family portfolio. My family portfolio. I'm sorry it ended this way, he continued, finally looking at me. You can keep the ring, of course, and I've already reached out to the wedding planner to cancel everything. No need for you to deal with that. How thoughtful, I almost laughed. Instead, I nodded, maintaining the calm demeanor that had served me well as the quiet power behind the Blackwell name. I appreciate that. I'll have your things shipped to Olivia's. He seemed relieved by my composure, mistaking it for acceptance rather than the calculated restraint it was. Harrison had never truly seen me. The strategic mind my grandfather had nurtured, the business acumen that had tripled our family holdings since I'd taken over management 5 years ago. He'd been attracted to the Blackwell name, the historic estate, the social connections, while remaining blissfully ignorant about who actually controlled it all. As his car disappeared down the long driveway, I pulled out my phone and made a single call. Melanie, Emma Blackwell, I need you to implement Contingency Protocol B, effective immediately. My assistant's response was immediate and professional. Understood. Timeline? Accelerated. All measures in place by end of week. I ended the call and watched the iron gates close behind Harrison's departing car. He had no idea what he'd just set in motion. I met Harrison 3 years ago at a charity gala for Boston Children's Hospital. I'd attended representing the Blackwell Foundation while he was there networking, though he'd called it supporting the cause. He was charming, with his perfectly timed wit and the confidence of someone who'd navigated elite social circles his entire life. What attracted me wasn't his looks, though Harrison was undeniably handsome in that conventional New England way. Tall, athletic build, strong jaw, and the kind of smile that suggested he'd never been denied anything. No, what caught my attention was his apparent ambition, his detailed plans for revitalizing struggling hotel properties, his vision for sustainable luxury tourism. I'd been raised to value vision. My grandfather, Richard Blackwell, had built our family's modest real estate holdings into a diversified empire through careful strategy and impeccable timing. After my parents' death when I was 12, he'd raised me himself, bringing me to meetings, teaching me to read financial statements, before teen magazines, showing me how power operated behind closed doors. "Never let them see everything you hold, Emma," he'd advised. "Keep your strongest cards hidden until you need them." I'd followed that advice when Harrison and I began dating. While he knew the Blackwells were comfortable, he didn't know the true extent of our holdings. He didn't know that at 25, I'd been named trustee of the entire family estate. He didn't know that the family business I occasionally mentioned involved controlling interests in everything from tech startups to, yes, hospitality groups. I maintained the persona he seemed to expect. The somewhat naive granddaughter of old, money impressed by his business acumen, supportive of his career aspirations. It wasn't entirely an act. I did admire his passion. But I kept my own capabilities carefully concealed, a habit ingrained through years of watching powerful men underestimate my grandfather's quiet granddaughter. Our engagement came after a year of dating. The ring was impressive. Harrison had made sure of that, though I later discovered he'd financed it through a personal loan. We planned a wedding at the Blackwell estate, an exclusive affair with carefully curated guests from Boston's elite circles. The kind of wedding that would cement Harrison's social standing and open doors for his career ambitions. The first sign of trouble came 6 months ago, when Harrison began working longer hours, growing distant. His texts became perfunctory, our conversations increasingly one-sided. I recognized the pattern, not from personal experience, but from the countless business negotiations I'd observed. Someone with a better offer, weighing their options. I hired a private investigator not out of jealousy or suspicion, but as due diligence. The reports confirmed what I'd suspected. Harrison had reconnected with Olivia Westfield, his college girlfriend. Coffee meetings that extended into dinners, late-night calls, weekend business trips that coincided with her visits from London. Rather than confront him, I began making preparations. I reviewed all shared assets, minimal, as I'd kept our finances largely separate on my grandfather's advice. I documented every gift I'd given Harrison, every opportunity I'd quietly facilitated. And I began activating the network I'd built over years of careful relationship cultivation. Attorneys, financial advisors, security specialists, PR consultants. When Harrison finally confessed his confusion about our relationship, I gave him the space he claimed to need. When he admitted to reconnecting with Olivia, I responded with understanding. And when he finally worked up the courage to cancel our wedding, coincidentally right after receiving an offer from Meridian Hotel Group for an executive position, I accepted his decision with dignity. What he didn't know was that I'd purchased Meridian through a shell company 3 weeks earlier, as soon as my investigator confirmed Olivia had permanently returned to Boston. What he didn't know was that every career opportunity that had mysteriously materialized over our 3 years together had come through channels I influenced. What he didn't know was that the prenuptial agreement he'd signed, the one he thought protected his assets from my family money, contained clauses that activated upon breach of engagement that would now prove financially devastating. Harrison had made a critical error. He'd confused my quietness for weakness, my privacy for lack of agency, my supportiveness for dependency. Like many before him, he'd failed to look beyond the carefully constructed surface. Now he would learn exactly who Emma Blackwell really was. My first call after implementing Contingency Protocol B was to Thomas Wright, the Blackwell family's lead attorney for 3 generations. "The engagement has ended," I said without preamble when he answered. Harrison terminated it to pursue a relationship with his ex-girlfriend. Thomas, ever the professional, didn't miss a beat. "I see. And you're certain this constitutes a clear breach under the terms of the agreement?" "He's already moved in with her. 2 weeks before our wedding date, with invitations sent and vendors paid. I'd call that definitive." Indeed, the sound of typing came through the line. "I'll prepare the paperwork immediately. We can file first thing tomorrow. The breach provisions are quite comprehensive. I want everything handled discreetly, I instructed. No public filing until the second phase is implemented. Of course. And the Meridian acquisition? Proceed as planned. Harrison begins his new position Monday. Let him have his first day. After hanging up, I moved through the estate with purposeful steps. The 19th century mansion had been in my family for 6 generations. Its grand architecture and meticulously maintained grounds a testament to Blackwell permanence. Harrison had loved playing Lord of the Manor during our engagement, conducting tours for impressed friends, hosting dinners in the formal dining room, treating the legacy as if it were already his birthright. In the eastern wing, I entered my private office, a room Harrison had never been invited into. Unlike the rest of the house with its carefully preserved historical aesthetic, this space was thoroughly modern, sleek ergonomic furniture, multiple monitors displaying real-time financial data. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. State-of-the-art security. This was command central for the true Blackwell enterprise. Melanie, my chief of staff, had already sent the preliminary contingency reports. I reviewed them methodically. Harrison's employment contract with Meridian, the one he thought offered him substantial equity options, had been modified to include performance clauses that would be impossible to meet. The townhouse Harrison had purchased last year, with a surprisingly generous mortgage approval, was financed through a subsidiary of Blackwell Capital. The terms could now be reviewed for any technical violations. The private club memberships that had facilitated his networking were up for annual review, their renewal suddenly uncertain. Every aspect of the comfortable life Harrison had built, much of it through connections he didn't realize I'd facilitated, was now subject to systematic reevaluation. Some might call it vindictive. I considered it correction of a misallocation of resources. My phone chimed with a text from Rachel, my oldest friend and the only person besides my grandfather who knew the full extent of my capabilities. Heard the news. Need company with wine or company with strategies? I smiled despite everything. Both. Dinner at 7? Her response was immediate. Already on my way. True to her word, Rachel arrived promptly at 7, armed with 2 bottles of excellent Cabernet and the ruthless analytical mind that had made her one of Boston's most feared corporate litigators. "So he really left you for Olivia Westfield?" she asked after I'd recounted the day's events. We were settled in my private study, the room intentionally designed to feel separate from the grandeur of the main house. The same woman who dumped him because he wasn't ambitious enough for her London banking circles. The very same. I swirled the wine in my glass. Apparently, his new executive position makes him suitable again. Rachel's laugh was sharp. "The position you arranged?" "Through channels he'd never trace back to me," I confirmed. "Harrison believes he earned it through his brilliant hospitality vision and impressive networking." "And does he have any idea what's coming?" "None. He thanked me for being so understanding about the canceled wedding. Said he hopes we can be friends eventually." Rachel nearly choked on her wine. "Friends? After he moved in with his ex 2 weeks before your wedding day? The audacity of mediocre men never ceases to amaze me." She leaned forward. "Walk me through the plan." For the next hour, I outlined the strategy I'd developed, not in the emotional aftermath of Harrison's betrayal, but methodically over the past 6 months as his deception became increasingly evident. Phase 1 is already in motion, I explained. The breach of engagement triggers the financial penalties in the prenuptial agreement. His accounts will be frozen by morning. He signed a prenup with breach penalties before you were even married. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Harrison thought it was mutual protection, his future assets against the Blackwell fortune. He didn't read the fine print about what constituted breach of good faith. Thomas made sure the language was deliberately complex. And phase 2? That begins Monday. Harrison starts at Meridian, unaware that the position has been restructured. Instead of executive vice president with equity options, he'll find himself in a senior director role, still impressive sounding, but with no actual authority and impossible performance metrics. Rachel nodded approvingly. Ensuring he fails while making it appear to be his own shortcomings. What about Olivia? She's not exactly an innocent bystander in this. Olivia returned to Boston because her position at Wellington Financial was eliminated. She doesn't know that her division's restructuring was initiated after Wellington took on Blackwell Capital as a major investor 3 months ago. Emma, Rachel said with admiration, you're absolutely terrifying. I've never been prouder to be your friend. I smiled thinly. I haven't even told you about phase 3. The weekend passed quietly. I maintained my normal routine, morning run along the estate's wooded paths, calls with overseas investment partners, review of quarterly projections. On Sunday evening, I attended the symphony gala I'd RSVP'd to months ago, arriving alone but hardly isolated. Boston's social elite had already heard about my canceled engagement, and their response was exactly as I'd anticipated. Thinly veiled curiosity masked as sympathy. Emma, darling, we were so shocked to hear, said Margaret Cavendish, board chair, of 3 prominent cultural institutions and a long-time family connection. Are you absolutely devastated? Hardly devastated, Margaret, I replied with a practiced smile. Some endings are necessary redirections. So philosophical. And will you still be hosting the conservation fundraiser next month? We weren't sure, given the circumstances. Of course. The estate is mine, after all. Harrison was merely a temporary guest. This exchange repeated with various inflections throughout the evening. I answered each inquiry with composed dignity, neither hiding from the gossip nor feeding it with emotional displays. By the time I departed, I'd received 4 dinner invitations, 2 introductions to eligible bachelors, and most importantly, subtle confirmations that Boston society understood which side of this broken engagement held the actual power. Monday. Morning brought the first ripples of my counter-strategy. At 9:17 a.m., my phone lit up with Harrison's name. Emma, he began without greeting, his voice tight with controlled panic. There seems to be some issue with my accounts. Everything's frozen, even my personal checking. The bank mentioned some kind of legal hold. How concerning, I replied, my tone neutral. Have you spoken with your attorney? That's just it. I tried calling James, but his secretary said he can't represent me due to a conflict of interest, something about his firm's association with Blackwell Enterprises. Of course there was a conflict. James Patterson had been on the Blackwell retainer for a decade, a fact Harrison had never bothered to investigate when accepting my recommendation. That's unfortunate timing, I said, especially with your new position starting today. A pause. How did you know I started today? You mentioned it when you were leaving, I believe. A small lie. Congratulations again. Meridian is a prestigious group. Emma? His voice lowered, a hint of his signature charm returning. I know this situation is uncomfortable, but I never intended to cause you financial hardship. If you're worried about wedding costs or the prenup... Harrison, I interrupted smoothly. I suggest you consult with a new attorney about the terms you signed. Thomas will provide any documentation they request. As for my financial situation, I assure you it's entirely secure. I don't understand what's happening here, he said, frustration breaking through. We were both so reasonable about everything. Why are you doing this now? I'm not doing anything, Harrison. I'm simply allowing the agreements you willingly signed to proceed as written. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a foundation meeting to attend. Best of luck with your first day. I ended the call and turned to Melanie, who had been waiting discreetly with my schedule for the day. He's discovered the account freezes, I noted. Sooner than expected. Melanie nodded. The bank called for verification at 8:30. Apparently, Mr. Reed attempted a significant transfer to a new account yesterday. Interesting? Moving assets already? I considered this development. Have Thomas expedite the filing and contact Meridian HR. It's time for Mr. Reed's orientation meeting with the CEO. The CEO being you, albeit through video conference, as the private investor, Melanie clarified with the ghost of a smile. Precisely. Let's schedule it for 2 p.m. That should give him just enough time to discover his actual position and compensation package. The foundation meeting proceeded, without incident, a routine review of quarterly grants and upcoming philanthropic initiatives. The Blackwell Foundation maintained a low public profile while providing substantial funding to carefully selected causes, primarily education for underprivileged youth and environmental conservation. My grandfather had established it as both tax strategy and genuine community investment, understanding that true power included the ability to effect positive change. At 1:45, I returned to my private office and prepared for the video conference. Harrison wouldn't see me, of course. He would instead meet Ms. Elizabeth Winters, the reclusive primary investor behind the recent Meridian acquisition. Ms. Winters, a professional actress with an impeccable British accent and background in corporate training, would explain the company's new vision and Harrison's role within it. Through secure monitoring, I watched Harrison enter the conference room at Meridian's headquarters. His expression already showed strain. The confident smile replaced by tightened jaw muscles and furrowed brow. The morning had clearly delivered unwelcome surprises. Mr. Reed, the Meridian HR director began, we're delighted to have you join the team. Before you meet your department, Ms. Winters has requested a brief introduction. Harrison straightened his tie, composing himself. Always ready to charm potential power brokers. The screen activated, revealing the elegant, silver-haired Ms. Winters in what appeared to be a London office, actually a meticulously designed set in my guest house. Mr. Reed, welcome, she began with crisp authority. I've reviewed your onboarding documents and noticed some discrepancies we should address immediately. Harrison's smile faltered slightly. Discrepancies? Yes. It seems you were under the impression you'd been hired as Executive Vice President of Operations with equity options. However, the approved position is Senior Director of Regional Development. Still quite prestigious, but without the executive authority or equity component. I watched the blood drain from Harrison's face. There must be some mistake, he managed. My offer letter clearly stated, I have your signed contract right here, Ms. Winters continued. Smoothly. Senior Director, base compensation as outlined on page 3, performance review at 6 months rather than the standard 12 given our accelerated improvement timelines. She held up the document, the actual contract Harrison had signed. Without thorough review, too eager to accept a title that would impress Olivia. Furthermore, Ms. Winters continued, your onboarding packet includes our code of conduct, which expressly prohibits undisclosed relationships with industry competitors. I understand your current residential arrangement involves cohabitation with an employee of Wellington Financial, which manages hospitality investment portfolios that directly compete with Meridian Properties. Harrison's mouth opened, then closed. Olivia's position, the one she'd accepted after her London division, was eliminated, placed her in technical conflict with his new role. A conflict I had carefully engineered through subtle influence with Wellington's board. I wasn't aware of any conflict, Harrison stammered. Olivia just recently joined Wellington, and her focus is primarily European markets. Nevertheless, disclosure is required. Please complete the relationship disclosure forms by end of day. Ms. Winters shuffled her papers. Now, regarding your performance targets for the first quarter, I watched as Harrison's dream position transformed before his eyes into a bureaucratic nightmare of impossible metrics, restricted authority, and ethical minefields. By the time the orientation concluded, his professional confidence had visibly crumbled. What Harrison didn't yet realize was that this was merely the beginning. Each day would bring new discoveries about just how comprehensively his comfortable world had been constructed and could be deconstructed by the woman he'd underestimated. That evening, I received 3 separate calls from Harrison, all of which I sent to voicemail. The messages progressed from confused to desperate to angry. The predictable emotional trajectory of a man discovering his safety nets had simultaneously disappeared. "Emma, we need to talk about what's happening with my accounts. Please call me back. This can't be legal. Whatever you're doing with these contracts and freezes, you can't just punish me because we broke up. Call me. This is absolutely ridiculous. I've contacted another attorney who says what you're doing constitutes harassment. If you don't fix this by tomorrow, we're going to have a serious problem." I listened to each message with clinical detachment, forwarding the last one to Thomas with a brief note. "Harrison has found new legal representation. Please prepare accordingly." His response came within minutes. "Already identified. Newly established practice, limited resources, no experience with contractual finance law. No concern." This was why the Blackwell family had retained Thomas Wright for decades. His thoroughness was unmatched, his foresight impeccable, his discretion absolute. Rachel called while I was reviewing the daily financial reports. Market. Positions closing exactly as anticipated despite recent volatility. "I heard Harrison had quite the first day," she said without preamble. Apparently, he called Olivia in tears from the Meridian parking lot. I set aside my tablet, intrigued. "How did you come by this information?" "Olivia's assistant is dating my paralegal. Office gossip travels fast." Rachel sounded immensely satisfied. "Want to know the best part? Olivia told him to man up and handle it because she had her own professional issues to deal with." "Trouble at Wellington already?" I asked, though I knew precisely what those issues would be. "Her entire department is under review. Budget cuts, performance audits, the works. Apparently, the major investor is concerned about inefficiencies." I allowed myself a small smile. The major investor, a Blackwell shell corporation, had indeed expressed concerns, triggering a comprehensive review that would keep Olivia fighting for her professional survival for weeks. Relationships forged in mutual crisis rarely survive the resolution of that crisis, I observed. Harrison and Olivia reconnected through shared ambition. Let's see how they manage shared failure. Rachel laughed. "You're absolutely chilling." "Sometimes, Emma. I love it." Her tone shifted to something more serious. "The Symphony Board is meeting tomorrow. Margaret Cavendish called to confirm you'll still be hosting the winter fundraiser. Apparently, some members questioned whether it would be appropriate given your personal situation." Translation. Boston society was watching carefully, waiting to see whether I would retreat in embarrassment over the canceled wedding or maintain my social standing. "Please assure Margaret that the Blackwell estate remains committed to the Symphony's winter program. In fact, I'm considering expanding our usual contribution." "Perfect. That should silence any concerns about your stability." Rachel's voice held a hint of amusement at the absurdity of anyone questioning my composure. "Any other moves I should know about?" Phase 2 continues tomorrow. Harrison encounters his new team and actual responsibilities at Meridian, which are implementing cost-cutting measures across 3 underperforming properties. He'll essentially be the face of layoffs and budget reductions. Not quite the visionary leadership role he anticipated. After ending the call with Rachel, I moved through the quiet grandeur of the estate, each room perfectly maintained by staff who had served the Blackwell family for generations. In the main library, a 2-story masterpiece of oak shelving and leather-bound first editions, I paused beside my grandfather's portrait. Richard Blackwell gazed out from the canvas with the same penetrating intelligence that had intimidated business rivals and reassured partners for 6 decades. He had raised me in this house after my parents' deaths, teaching me to see beyond surface appearances, to recognize true value amid artifice. "Power doesn't announce itself, Emma," he'd told me repeatedly. "Real influence operates quietly, patiently, with precision rather than flash. Let others underestimate you. It's the greatest advantage you'll ever have." Harrison had certainly underestimated me. From our first meeting, he'd seen what he expected to see. A privileged heiress with a I, distinguished family name but limited personal agency. He'd recognized the value of the Blackwell connection, but failed to look deeper, to question why a family with such extensive holdings would entrust them to someone supposedly naive and dependent. His assumption that I needed his business acumen, his market insights, his guidance, when in reality I controlled investment portfolios that dwarfed anything he'd ever managed, reflected a blindness born of arrogance. A blindness I had carefully encouraged, playing to his expectations while observing his true character. And what I'd observed had disappointed me long before Olivia's return. Harrison's loyalty extended precisely as far as his advantage. His ethics bent according to opportunity. His professed values, integrity, partnership, transparency, were performative rather than foundational. The canceled wedding hadn't broken my heart. It had simply confirmed my assessment. Morning arrived with a clarity that matched my purpose. I dressed with particular care in a tailored charcoal suit, pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother, hair swept into a precise chignon. Today marked my monthly appearance at Blackwell Capital's executive meeting, one of the few occasions when I emerged from behind the carefully constructed barriers that separated my identity from the family's business operations. Officially, I attended these meetings as the Blackwell Trust representative, a technically accurate but deliberately limited description. The senior executives knew I held significant influence, but remained unaware that every major decision ultimately required my approval. As I entered the sleek downtown offices, administrative staff greeted me with the deference accorded to important, but infrequent visitors. Mark Peterson, the public-facing CEO, met me at the elevator. "Ms. Blackwell, wonderful to see you," he said, escorting me toward the conference room. "We have a full agenda today, including the Wellington financial situation and the Meridian integration timeline." "Excellent. And the Sullivan portfolio transition?" Mark nodded. "Moving forward as instructed. The market response has been precisely as the analysis predicted." I noted his correction with private amusement. Mark was competent and loyal, compensated extraordinarily well to execute strategies while believing they emerged from collaborative leadership rather than singular direction. The executive meeting proceeded efficiently, each department head presenting quarterly results and projections. I occasionally asked pointed questions, ostensibly seeking clarification as the trust representative, but actually guiding discussions toward conclusions I'd already determined. When the Wellington financial briefing began, I paid particular attention. "The audit is proceeding as directed," reported Caroline Torres, head of Financial Services Integration. "Initial findings suggest significant redundancies in their European markets division." "Affecting how many positions?" I asked. "Approximately 30, including 6 senior analysts and the division director." "Olivia's position, right on schedule." "And the timeline for restructuring recommendations?" "We'll have preliminary findings by Friday. Implementation options next week." I nodded. "Ensure the recommendations focus on strategic realignment rather than simple cost-cutting. We want Wellington to emerge stronger, but thoroughly transformed." "Of course, Ms. Blackwell." As the meeting concluded, Mark pulled me aside with a concerned expression. "There's a small matter that might require your attention. A gentleman named Harrison Reed has been attempting to schedule a meeting with senior leadership. He's apparently in a director role at Meridian and claiming some prior connection to the Blackwell family." I maintained a neutral expression. Mr. Reed was briefly engaged to me. The relationship ended recently. Mark's eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication of his surprise at this personal disclosure. I see. He's been quite insistent, suggesting he has insights into Blackwell operations that would interest us. How enterprising of him, I remarked dryly. Please inform Mr. Reed that Blackwell Capital doesn't engage with mid-level directors from subsidiary companies, regardless of their former personal connections. If he has legitimate business concerns, they should be addressed through proper Meridian channels. Understood. I'll handle it personally. Thank you, Mark, and perhaps review Meridian's confidentiality protocols. We shouldn't have directors attempting to leverage personal relationships for professional advantage. The implication was clear. Harrison's behavior would be documented as a potential ethics violation, adding another black mark to his rapidly deteriorating professional situation. As I departed Blackwell Capital's offices, my phone buzzed with a message from the security service that monitored the estate. Harrison's car had been detected approaching the main gate, his third attempt to gain entry since moving his belongings to Olivia's townhouse. I texted a brief instruction. Standard protocol. Documentation continued. The standard protocol was simply this. Harrison would be politely but firmly informed by security that he was no longer authorized to enter Blackwell property. His reaction, invariably frustrated and increasingly hostile, would be recorded, establishing a pattern of behavior that could prove useful if legal intervention became necessary. My driver, Michael, navigated through Boston's midday traffic with practiced efficiency. "The usual lunch, Ms. Blackwell?" he asked, catching my eye in the rearview mirror. "Yes, thank you, Michael." The usual lunch on executive meeting days was at Maison Laurent, an exclusive French restaurant where the Blackwell family had maintained a permanent reservation for 3 generations. The maitre d' greeted me by name, escorting me to the private alcove that offered both discretion and a view of the main dining room. I had just placed my order when I noticed Olivia Westfield entering the restaurant, accompanied by 2 colleagues I recognized as Wellington senior managers. Their expressions were grim. Their conversation appeared intense. The Wellington restructuring was clearly the topic of discussion. Olivia hadn't seen me yet. I observed her surreptitiously, noting the signs of strain beneath her polished appearance. The woman who had deemed Harrison insufficient for her ambitions, then reclaimed him when his prospects seemed improved, was now facing her own professional crisis, just as I'd orchestrated. My phone rang, disrupting my contemplation. Thomas. Wright's name appeared on the screen. "Thomas," I answered quietly. "Updates?" "Mr. Reed's new attorney has formally responded to the account freezes," he reported. "Rather amateur work, frankly. They're demanding immediate release of all funds and threatening various legal actions, none of which apply to the circumstances." And our response? I've provided the full contractual documentation, highlighted the specific breaches, and outlined the penalties triggered by those breaches. I've also included a preliminary accounting of financial damages resulting from the canceled wedding, including non-refundable vendor contracts, consultant fees, and reputation considerations. Their likely next move? Based on the caliber of representation Mr. Reed has secured, I anticipate an emotional rather than strategic response. Possibly an attempt to claim duress in the original signing or misrepresentation of terms. Both easily refuted. Entirely refuted, Thomas confirmed. "We have video documentation of the signing session, your grandfather's standard procedure. Mr. Reed received independent legal counsel, requested minimal changes which were accommodated, and expressed complete satisfaction with the final agreement." "Perfect. Proceed as planned, but delay filings by 48 hours. I want to give his attorney time to advise him of the futility of their position." As I ended the call, I noticed Olivia had spotted me. Her expression froze momentarily before she composed herself, murmuring something to her colleagues before approaching my table. "Emma," she greeted with forced cordiality. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Olivia," I replied, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. "Would you care to join me?" She hesitated, glancing back at her waiting colleagues. "I'm in the middle of a business lunch, actually." "Of course. Wellington must be keeping you quite busy with the reorganization." A flicker of surprise crossed her face. "You've heard about that?" "Boston's financial community is rather close-knit," I replied vaguely. "I hope it's not affecting your position too severely." "It's just a standard efficiency review," she said, though her tight smile betrayed her concern. "These things happen when new investors come aboard." "Indeed they do." I took a deliberate sip of water. "How is Harrison adapting to Meridian?" I understand there was some confusion about his role. Olivia's perfectly maintained composure slipped, just slightly. "Harrison is adjusting." There were some miscommunications during the recruitment process, apparently. "How unfortunate, especially with the significant career change and relocation. Quite a lot of transition at once." "We're managing," she replied stiffly. Then, with visible reluctance, "Emma, I hope you understand that I never intended. That is, Harrison and I reconnected innocently. When he explained that your relationship had been strained for some time." "Did he?" I interrupted softly. "How interesting. Our wedding invitations had been sent just 2 weeks earlier." Olivia had the grace to look uncomfortable. "He said you'd both been having doubts, that the wedding momentum had taken over despite mutual reservations." A convenient narrative. My tone remained pleasant, conversational. "Well, I won't keep you from your colleagues. I imagine there's much to discuss with Wellington's European division under such scrutiny." Her eyes narrowed, slightly. "You seem remarkably well informed about Wellington's internal matters." I smiled. "As I said, Boston's financial world is quite interconnected. Good day, Olivia." As she returned to her table, visibly unsettled, I returned my attention to my meal. The encounter had been illuminating. Harrison had crafted a fiction about our relationship to justify his actions to Olivia, while she had accepted this convenient explanation without question. They deserved each other, really. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. "Judge Harmond assigned to contract dispute case. Couldn't have asked for better." Another piece falling perfectly into place. Judge Eleanor Harmond was known for her strict interpretation of contract law and zero tolerance for what she called romantic regret, attempts to escape legal obligations due to relationship changes. By the time I returned to the estate that afternoon, 3 significant developments had occurred. First, Harrison had been publicly reprimanded at Meridian for attempting to contact Blackwell Capital leadership outside proper channels. Second, Olivia had been called into an emergency meeting regarding her department's future. And third, Boston's most exclusive social blog had published a sympathetic piece about my dignified response to pre-wedding abandonment, featuring comments from several prominent society figures expressing support for the Blackwell family's continued philanthropy. Despite personal disappointment, public opinion, professional standing, and legal positioning, all 3 dimensions shifting precisely as I'd orchestrated. I spent the remainder of the afternoon in my private office, reviewing quarterly performance across the Blackwell portfolio. Despite recent market volatility, our positions remained strong, particularly in the technology and sustainable energy sectors my grandfather had presciently emphasized in his later years. Melanie entered with the day's final briefing packet. Security reports Mr. Reed made another attempt to access the estate at 4:15 p.m. When denied entry, he became verbally aggressive, threatening to expose the truth about the Blackwells. The incident has been documented and added to the file. Thank you, Melanie. Any updates from Meridian? Mr. Reed's first team meeting didn't go well. He attempted to revise the restructuring plan to preserve jobs, but was overruled by senior management. He's been instructed to implement the original cuts as scheduled. I nodded, unsurprised. Harrison would now be forced to terminate employees at the very properties he'd once spoken passionately about revitalizing, an irony that wouldn't be lost on him. And the Wellington situation? Proceeding as anticipated, Ms. Westfield has been placed on administrative leave pending the department review. Her access to company systems has been suspended as a standard procedure. Perfect. Olivia's professional crisis would now demand her complete attention, leaving Harrison to navigate his own mounting problems without her support. As evening fell, I walked through the estate's extensive gardens, the early autumn air crisp with promise. The formal landscaping with its geometric hedges and classical statuary had been designed to convey permanence and order, values the Blackwell family had cultivated for generations. My phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. After a moment's consideration, I answered. Emma Blackwell. Ms. Blackwell, this is James Donovan. I represent Harrison Reed in the matter of your contractual dispute. The hesitation was telling, an attorney uncomfortable with the case he'd taken on. Mr. Donovan, I believe my counsel has provided all necessary documentation regarding Mr. Reed's contractual obligations. Yes, well, that's why I'm calling. After reviewing the agreements, I feel it would be beneficial for all parties to discuss a potential resolution that avoids protracted litigation. Translation. After seeing the ironclad contract and overwhelming evidence, he was advising Harrison to settle. I'm certainly open to reasonable discussion, I replied. However, the terms would need to acknowledge the substantiated breaches and resulting damages. My client feels the penalties are disproportionate to any alleged breach, freezing all. His accounts has placed him in an untenable position, unable to meet basic living expenses. Your client received substantial financial benefits during our engagement, Mr. Donovan. Benefits predicated on contractual commitments he chose to violate in a particularly public and humiliating manner. The current restrictions are entirely consistent with the remedies he agreed to. A pause. Ms. Blackwell, speaking candidly, Mr. Reed is prepared to share information about Blackwell family business operations with interested parties if this matter isn't resolved favorably. I nearly laughed at the clumsy attempt at leverage. Mr. Donovan, I strongly advise you to reconsider transmitting threats on your client's behalf. Any information Mr. Reed believes he possesses about Blackwell operations was obtained under confidentiality provisions that survive relationship termination. Attempting to disclose such information would constitute additional contractual violations and potentially criminal activity. I'm simply conveying my client's position, he backpedaled quickly. Then allow me to convey mine. If Mr. Reed wishes to avoid further legal complications, he will cease all attempts to contact me personally, refrain from approaching Blackwell properties, and work through proper counsel to address his contractual obligations. Is that clear? I'll discuss these points with my client. Please do. Good evening, Mr. Donovan. I ended the call, making a mental note to have Thomas document this conversation. Harrison's threat, however poorly executed, demonstrated escalating desperation. He was beginning to realize the true extent of his vulnerability. Back in my study, I reviewed the day's developments and adjusted timelines accordingly. Harrison was unraveling faster than anticipated, while Olivia's professional situation had deteriorated precisely on schedule. The legal positioning remained strongly in my favor, and Boston society had largely aligned behind my narrative of dignified resilience. Phase 2 was proceeding even more effectively than planned. It was time to prepare for Phase 3, the complete dismantling of the life Harrison thought he was building with Olivia. My phone buzzed with a text from a private security contact. Subject arrived at residence visibly intoxicated. Verbal altercation with W ongoing. So Harrison and Olivia were already fighting, their relationship straining under the pressure of dual professional crises. Exactly as I'd predicted. I had just settled in with a portfolio review when security alerted me to another approach at the estate gates. This time, however, it wasn't Harrison, but Olivia's distinctive BMW. Interesting. She had never visited the estate without Harrison. "Allow her entry," I instructed the security team. "Direct her to the main house and maintain full monitoring." I moved to the formal living room, deliberately selecting a space that emphasized Blackwell history and permanence. Family portraits spanning generations lined the walls, priceless antiques occupied carefully arranged vignettes, and the massive fireplace, its mantel carved from a single piece of Italian marble, dominated the far wall. When Olivia was escorted in by the house manager, her expression revealed momentary awe before she composed herself. The Westfield family was comfortable, but not at this level of wealth. The contrast between her Beacon Hill townhouse and the Blackwell estate wasn't subtle. "Olivia," I greeted her calmly, not rising from my seat. "This is unexpected." She remained standing, clearly uncomfortable. "Emma, thank you for seeing me without an appointment." "Of course, please sit. Would you like tea? Something stronger? Perhaps?" "Nothing, thank you." She perched on the edge of an antique settee, her posture rigid. "I'm here about Harrison." "I assumed as much. Is he aware you've come?" "No." She twisted her hands in her lap. "He's been difficult since all this began. Angry, confused, drinking too much." "All this?" I kept my expression neutral. "The account freezes, the job situation. He says you're behind it all somehow, that you're punishing him for ending the engagement." I allowed the silence to stretch, watching her discomfort grow. "Harrison made certain choices," I finally said. "Those choices had consequences specified in agreements he willingly signed. That's not punishment, Olivia. It's contract enforcement. He says the penalties are excessive, that no reasonable person would have agreed to them if they'd understood." "Are you suggesting Harrison signed legal documents without understanding them? That doesn't speak well for his business acumen." Olivia flushed slightly. "He thought it was standard prenuptial language. Then he should have consulted more careful advisors." I leaned forward slightly. "Why are you really here, Olivia? Surely not to plead Harrison's case." Her composure faltered. "My position at Wellington is being eliminated. The entire European division is being restructured. 3 years in London, building that department, and now it's simply gone." "The financial sector can be volatile," I observed, "especially when new investors have different strategic visions." She studied me with sudden intensity. "You know something about this? About Wellington's investors?" I met her gaze steadily. "Boston's financial community is surprisingly interconnected." "That's what you said at the restaurant." Her eyes narrowed. "Emma, are you somehow involved with Wellington's restructuring? With what's happening at Meridian?" Instead of answering directly, I stood and walked to the fireplace, adjusting a photo frame. My grandparents on their wedding day, radiating the quiet confidence of people secure in their position. Do you know why my grandfather was so successful, Olivia? Because he understood that actions create ripples. Every decision, every relationship formed or broken, every promise kept or abandoned, all generate consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment. I turned back to face her. Harrison didn't simply end our engagement. He violated carefully constructed agreements while attempting to leverage Blackwell connections for personal advancement. He misrepresented our relationship to mutual acquaintances. He attempted to claim credit for opportunities that were never his to claim. Olivia's expression shifted from confusion to dawning realization. "You're saying all of this, Harrison's job problems, my department's elimination, is your doing. I'm saying that Harrison made choices without considering their full implications. Perhaps you did as well." She stood abruptly. "This is insane. You can't just destroy people's careers because of a personal rejection. Is that what you think happened? A personal rejection? I kept my voice level. Harrison didn't simply decide his heart belonged elsewhere, Olivia. He calculated that a relationship with you offered better advantages once your London position and his supposed executive role aligned. He saw opportunity and pivoted accordingly. You don't know anything about our relationship. I know it. Resumed precisely when his career prospects appeared to improve. I know you showed no interest in reconnecting until the Meridian executive offer materialized. I know opportunism when I see it, Olivia. I was raised to recognize it. Her face paled. What do you want? Why am I here? You came of your own accord. But since you're asking, perhaps take a message back to Harrison. The consequences he's experiencing are entirely of his own making. They can worsen or improve depending on his next choices. Are you threatening us? Not at all. I'm clarifying reality. I moved toward the door, indicating our conversation was concluding. Harrison has options. He can continue fighting obligations he willingly accepted, making threats he can't support, and experiencing the resulting consequences. Or he can acknowledge his breaches, accept reasonable settlement terms, and move forward with the understanding that Blackwell connections are permanently closed to him. And me? What about my career? I paused, giving her question apparent consideration. Your professional situation is unfortunate. However, I understand Wellington is offering generous severance packages to affected employees. Perhaps view it as an opportunity to reassess priorities. As Olivia departed, visibly shaken, I returned to my study to document the encounter. Her visit had been unexpected, but ultimately useful. She would now understand that the mounting pressures weren't coincidental, but orchestrated. A realization that would inevitably affect her relationship with Harrison. Phase 3 could now begin in earnest. The complete separation of Harrison from any remaining Blackwell connections. The systematic dismantling of the professional reputation he'd spent years building, and the final demonstration of exactly who controlled the Blackwell family's extensive influence. My grandfather had taught me that true power never needed to announce itself. Today, I had made an exception to that rule, allowing Olivia a glimpse behind the curtain. Not out of cruelty or vindictiveness, but strategic necessity. Sometimes understanding the full dimension of one's situation was the only path to accepting its resolution. Harrison had made a critical error in judgment, mistaking my reserved manner for weakness, my privacy for lack of agency, my accommodating nature for dependence. In doing so, he had triggered consequences beyond his imagination. Whether he would emerge from this experience wiser remained to be seen. What was certain was that he would emerge humbled, his carefully constructed self-image as a strategic, business mind thoroughly dismantled. And I would continue as I always had, quietly controlling the empire my grandfather had entrusted to me, allowing others their illusions about where true power resided, and maintaining the Blackwell legacy of consequence and calculation. Morning arrived with a gentle autumn rain tapping against the windows of the estate. I reviewed the overnight security reports while enjoying my coffee by the library fireplace. Harrison had attempted to call me 17 times after Olivia's visit, each call sent directly to voicemail, each message increasingly desperate. The final call, placed at 2:43 a.m., contained nothing but ragged breathing and what sounded like a glass being set down heavily. Melanie arrived precisely at 8, her expression revealing nothing as she placed a folder on the side table. The complete documentation from Mr. Reed's attorney has arrived, she said. Mr. Wright has reviewed it and suggests you'll find page 12 particularly illuminating. I opened the folder and flipped to the indicated page, where Harrison's lawyer had outlined a proposed settlement. Limited access to frozen funds in exchange for Harrison's silence about Blackwell family business practices. It appears Mr. Reed believes he possesses leverage, I observed, closing the folder. Mr. Wright anticipated this approach. His response has already been prepared for your review. I nodded. Schedule a call with Thomas for 10 o'clock, and what news from Meridian this morning? Mr. Reed failed to appear for his scheduled department meeting. His assistant reported receiving a text claiming illness. However, security cameras at Ms. Westfield's residence show his car has not moved since yesterday evening. So Harrison was avoiding his professional responsibilities already, exactly as I'd predicted when designing his impossible performance. Metrics. The pressure was building exactly as planned. And Wellington Financial? The European division restructuring was formally announced this morning. Ms. Westfield and 17 other employees have been placed on immediate administrative leave with severance packages pending. I sipped my coffee thoughtfully. Has the press picked up the Wellington story yet? The business journals have noted the restructuring, but without specific personnel details. However, the social blog that covered your dignified response to the canceled engagement has published a follow-up piece. She handed me a tablet displaying the article. The headline read, "Jilted heiress rises while ex-fiancé's career crumbles. Coincidence or consequence?" The piece stopped short of claiming I was directly responsible for Harrison's professional downturn, but certainly implied a connection, citing anonymous sources who noted the remarkable timing of his difficulties. Following our broken engagement, public perception was shifting precisely as anticipated. Boston society loved a narrative of justice served, especially when it featured old money dignity prevailing over opportunistic social climbing. At 10 o'clock, Thomas Wright's call came through on the secure line in my study. "Emma," he greeted. Me, his voice carrying the measured confidence of decades in legal practice. "I've reviewed Mr. Donovan's proposal. It's essentially an attempted blackmail poorly disguised as negotiation." I thought the same, I agreed. Harrison believes he can leverage some imagined insider knowledge about Blackwell operations. A fundamental miscalculation. Mr. Reed was never privy to actual Blackwell business structures or decisions. Whatever information he thinks he possesses is either publicly available or deliberately inaccurate. This was true. During our engagement, I'd occasionally allowed Harrison to believe he was being included in business discussions, when in reality, he'd been exposed only to carefully constructed versions of minor operations, never anything that revealed the true extent or nature of Blackwell Holdings. "Your proposed response?" I asked. Direct and unequivocal rejection of his terms, coupled with a counteroffer that emphasizes his increasingly precarious position. I've drafted language that reminds him of the confidentiality provisions he signed, the penalties for violation, and the documentation we possess regarding his acknowledged understanding of those terms. Perfect. And the timeline? The response will be delivered this afternoon. Given Mr. Reed's deteriorating financial situation and Ms. Westfield's employment developments, I anticipate increased pressure on their relationship, likely leading to a more reasonable approach within 48 hours. I considered this assessment. And if Harrison becomes more desperate rather than more reasonable, then we proceed to the contingency filing, which would trigger the complete enforcement clause. All assets acquired during your relationship would revert to Blackwell control, including his vehicle, investment accounts, and the professional memberships established under your sponsorship. Proceed with the response as drafted, I decided. Let's see how Harrison responds to absolute clarity about his position. After concluding the call with Thomas, I prepared for my next appointment, lunch with Judge Eleanor Harmond, officially a social engagement between longtime family connections, unofficially an opportunity to subtly reinforce the merits of strict contractual enforcement in modern relationship dissolutions. Judge Harmond had been a friend of my grandfather's, one of the few women in her law school class, and now one of Boston's most respected jurists. She had no direct involvement in my case with Harrison, but her influence on judicial philosophy throughout the district was considerable. We met at a discreet club that had only recently, after considerable pressure, begun admitting women members. The judge had been instrumental in that change, using her considerable influence to modernize the institution while respecting its traditions. "Emma, my dear," she greeted me warmly as I joined her at a corner table overlooking the club's immaculate gardens. "You're looking remarkably well considering the circumstances I've been hearing about." "Thank you, Eleanor. I believe in facing challenges directly rather than allowing them to define me." Her smile was approving. A true Blackwell response. "Your grandfather would be proud." The conversation flowed naturally through family connections, mutual acquaintances, and subtle Boston politics. Judge Harmond had perfected the art of discussing significant matters while appearing to engage in mere social pleasantries. "I've been seeing an unfortunate trend in my courtroom," she remarked as our main course arrived. "Young professionals entering prenuptial and property agreements with apparent understanding, then claiming ignorance or duress when those agreements prove disadvantageous." "How troubling," I responded. "One would hope that agreements freely entered would be honored, regardless of changing circumstances." Precisely my view. I've been quite firm on this point in recent rulings. If capable adults choose to establish contractual frameworks for their relationships, they must be held to those frameworks. Anything less undermines the entire premise of contract law. "A refreshingly principled position," I noted. "I imagine it's not always popular." "Popularity has never been my concern," she replied with a slight smile. "The integrity of legal agreements, however, most certainly is." By the time we concluded lunch, Judge Harmond had shared her philosophical approach to several recent cases involving relationship contracts, emphasizing her belief that emotional changes didn't invalidate legal obligations. While never directly mentioning my situation with Harrison, she had effectively communicated her likely response to any case resembling ours. As we parted, she clasped my hand warmly. "Your grandfather always said you were the most clear-eyed of the Blackwells. I'm seeing that clarity now. Whatever challenges you're facing, I have complete confidence in your ability to navigate them appropriately." The implied support was precisely what I'd hoped to secure. Not direct intervention. Judge Harmond was far too ethical for that. But philosophical alignment and social validation. Should Harrison's case eventually reach her courtroom, she would approach it with her principles firmly established. Back at the estate, I found Rachel waiting in my study, her expression suggesting significant developments. "Harrison's been terminated from Meridian," she announced without preamble, effective immediately. This was sooner than I'd anticipated. "On what grounds?" "Failure to perform essential job functions, insubordination, and violation of company communication policies." Apparently, he sent a rather unhinged email to the entire executive team accusing them of setting him up to fail. "Which they were," I noted, "but proving that would require insights he doesn't possess." Rachel nodded. "The termination letter specifically mentioned his unauthorized attempts to contact Blackwell Capital leadership as evidence of professional boundary violations. He's been escorted from the building and his access revoked." "And Olivia?" "That's the other news. Wellington's severance offer requires a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement regarding all company operations, client relationships, and investment strategies. She's refusing to sign, claiming the terms are punitive rather than protective." I allowed myself a small smile. Her legal advisors should encourage her to reconsider. Without that signed agreement, Wellington has no obligation to provide any severance package, which would leave both Harrison and Olivia unemployed simultaneously, Rachel observed. "Quite a test for a relationship founded on mutual ambition." "Indeed." I moved to the window, gazing out at the meticulously maintained grounds. "Has Harrison made any attempt to contact you?" Rachel had been publicly identified as my closest friend. It would be logical for Harrison to approach her as a potential intermediary. "He called yesterday," she confirmed. I didn't answer, but he left a message claiming he's being systematically destroyed, and begging me to reason with you. He sounded. She hesitated. Desperate? I suggested. Unraveling, she corrected. There was something in his voice I've never heard before, almost frightened. This assessment aligned with my expectations. Harrison was experiencing the systematic dismantling of everything he valued: professional standing, financial security, social position, even his relationship with Olivia. The carefully constructed facade of the confident, successful businessman was cracking under pressure deliberately applied to its weakest points. The final stage approaches, I noted. Harrison will soon be faced with a fundamental choice: accept the significant but survivable consequences I've outlined, or continue fighting and risk complete professional and personal destruction. Rachel studied me with a mixture of admiration and concern. You've orchestrated all of this with remarkable precision. Not just Harrison's downfall, but the exact pressure points, the perfect timing, the complete isolation. It's almost justice, I supplied when she hesitated. Not revenge, Rachel. Justice. Harrison made calculated decisions to exploit Blackwell connections while betraying Blackwell trust. He's experiencing the natural consequences of those decisions. She nodded slowly. And the collateral damage to Olivia? She chose to participate in Harrison's betrayal, believing it would advance her own interests. Her current circumstances reflect that choice. My phone buzzed with a message from Thomas Wright. Reed's attorney has withdrawn representation, cited irreconcilable differences regarding case strategy. Reed now unrepresented. I showed the message to Rachel, whose eyebrows rose. That was fast. Most attorneys will tolerate difficult clients if they're being paid. Harrison likely couldn't meet the retainer requirements once his termination from Meridian was processed, I explained. His accounts remain frozen, and now his income stream has vanished. Rachel's expression grew serious. Emma, I need to ask, how far do you intend to take this? Harrison is clearly spiraling. At what point does justice become something else? I considered her question carefully. Rachel was one of the few people whose moral compass I truly respected. If she was concerned about proportionality, her perspective deserved consideration. I don't seek Harrison's destruction, I said finally. Only his complete understanding of the consequences of his actions. Once that understanding is achieved, demonstrated through proper legal acknowledgement and behavioral change, the pressure will ease. And if that understanding doesn't come, if he continues fighting, becomes more erratic, then the consequences continue until he reaches the inevitable conclusion that acceptance is his only viable option. As Rachel departed, promising to keep me updated on any further contact attempts from Harrison, I reviewed the day's developments. Each element was proceeding as designed, though Harrison's professional collapse was accelerating faster than anticipated. This acceleration would increase pressure on his relationship with Olivia, potentially triggering the final phase sooner than planned. I spent the remainder of the afternoon reviewing the Blackwell Foundation's quarterly grant proposals, maintaining the normal rhythms of my responsibilities despite the strategic campaign unfolding in parallel. My grandfather had insisted that personal matters should never interfere with professional obligations, a principle I honored even while orchestrating Harrison's comprehensive reality adjustment. As evening approached, security alerted me to unusual activity. Harrison's car had been identified approaching the estate gates, but this time accompanied by Olivia's BMW. They were attempting a joint visit, a new development that suggested changing dynamics in their relationship. Allow them to reach the gate, I instructed security, but maintain standard protocols, full documentation. Through the security feed, I watched as both vehicles stopped at the closed entrance. Harrison emerged first, his appearance notably deteriorated since I'd last seen him. His clothing was rumpled, his normally impeccable hair disheveled, his movements agitated. Olivia joined him, her expression a mixture of reluctance and determination. They spoke briefly to each other before Harrison approached the intercom. I switched on the audio feed. "Emma!" His voice was ragged. "I know you can see me. We need to talk. This has gone far enough." When no response came, he continued, his tone increasingly desperate. "Everything's falling apart. My job, Olivia's. Position, our accounts. You've orchestrated all of it, haven't you? Just to punish me?" He pounded on the gate, an act of futility against the heavy iron. "You can't do this. You can't just destroy people's lives because I chose someone else. It's not right." Olivia approached, placing a restraining hand on his arm. "Harrison, this isn't helping. She's not going to respond to threats or accusations." "Then what?" he demanded, turning to her. "What am I supposed to do? She's taken everything." "We request a proper meeting," Olivia replied, glancing toward the security camera. "Through appropriate channels, like civilized people." The contrast between them was striking. Harrison increasingly unhinged, Olivia attempting to maintain some semblance of strategic approach. She clearly recognized the futility of emotional appeals against methodical consequences. I picked up the phone and called Thomas Wright. "Harrison and Olivia are at the gate. She's attempting to establish formal communication. Prepare the preliminary settlement terms we discussed and make them available for review tomorrow. Standard protocols, formal meeting environment." "Understood," Thomas replied. "Shall I communicate this to them directly?" "Yes. Inform them that I'm willing to discuss reasonable resolution through proper channels. A meeting can be arranged at your offices tomorrow at 2 p.m. Both parties should come prepared to discuss concrete terms rather than emotional grievances." I ended the call and returned my attention to the security feed. Harrison continued his increasingly incoherent demands while Olivia checked her phone, presumably receiving Thomas's message. She showed the screen to Harrison, whose tirade paused momentarily. "This is a trap," he declared, loud enough for the microphones to capture. "She just wants to humiliate us further." "It's a way forward," Olivia countered. "The only one we have right now. We need to approach this pragmatically." Their subsequent argument was conducted in lower voices, but their body language revealed the growing tension between them. Harrison gesturing wildly, Olivia maintaining rigid composure, the distance between them visibly widening. Finally, Olivia returned to her car without Harrison, who continued his futile address to the security cameras for several more minutes before finally departing as well. Not in the direction of Beacon Hill, but toward downtown, their vehicles headed in separate directions. The relationship was fracturing exactly as anticipated. Olivia, ever the pragmatist, recognized the need for strategic compromise. Harrison, his ego unable to accept defeat, continued fighting against incontrovertible reality. I texted Rachel a brief update. Confrontation at gates. Settlement meeting arranged for tomorrow. H and O leaving separately. Her response came quickly. Division already. Predictable, but still impressive. Need me there tomorrow? Not necessary. Thomas handling formalities. Will update after. That evening, I reviewed the preliminary settlement terms Thomas had prepared. They were firm, but not vindictive. Harrison would acknowledge his contractual violations and surrender certain property assets and professional connections, while retaining enough personal resources to rebuild a modest life. The non-disclosure and non-disparagement provisions were comprehensive, preventing him from attempting to retaliate through reputation damage. Olivia wasn't mentioned directly, but specialized clauses ensured that information sharing with her would constitute additional violations. The terms represented a significant defeat for Harrison, but not complete destruction. He would emerge humbled, but not destitute, professionally, diminished but not unemployable, socially demoted, but not entirely ostracized. Whether he would recognize this relative mercy remained to be seen. Morning brought news that Harrison had not returned to Olivia's townhouse. According to my security sources, he'd spent the night at a downtown hotel, charging the room to a credit card that would inevitably be declined when processed. Olivia had remained at her residence, making numerous phone calls to financial advisors and legal consultants. They were preparing separate strategies for the upcoming meeting, another sign of their relationship's deterioration under pressure. I dressed with particular care that morning, selecting a conservative charcoal suit that projected authority without ostentation, accessorized with my grandmother's pearls, a subtle reminder of Blackwell lineage and permanence. My appearance would communicate confidence and institutional power, contrasting sharply with Harrison's increasingly disheveled state. Thomas called at 11 to confirm the meeting details. "Mr. Reed has requested to meet with you privately, before the formal session," he informed me. I advised against it, but he's quite insistent. "Denied," I replied without hesitation. "All communication through proper channels, with appropriate representation present." As expected. Ms. Westfield has secured independent counsel, Patricia Alvarez from Brookline Associates. Competent, but not particularly aggressive. She specializes in negotiated settlements rather than litigation. This alignment with my assessment of Olivia's approach was satisfying. She recognized the futility of direct confrontation and was positioning herself for damage control rather than victory. And Harrison? Has he secured new representation? Not formally. He's consulted with 3 different firms since yesterday, but no retention agreements have been filed. My sources suggest he's having difficulty meeting their financial requirements. So he'll be representing himself this afternoon? It appears so. I've prepared accordingly. Self-representation was the worst possible approach for Harrison. Ensuring his emotional reactions would undermine any strategic position. Another predictable error from a man whose judgment had proven consistently flawed. At 1:30, I arrived at Thomas Wright's offices in a discreet but prestigious building near Boston Common. The conference room had been prepared according to my specifications. Formal seating arrangements that established clear power dynamics, documentation organized in precise portfolios, refreshments available but not prominently displayed. Ms. Westfield and her attorney arrived 10 minutes ago, Thomas informed me as we reviewed final preparations. They're waiting in the East Conference Room. Mr. Reed has not yet appeared. He'll make a deliberately late entrance, I predicted. An attempt to assert some control over the proceedings. Allow it without comment. Sure enough, Harrison arrived 17 minutes after the scheduled start time, alone and visibly tense. His suit, once immaculately tailored, hung awkwardly on his frame, suggesting recent weight loss. The confident swagger he'd always affected had been replaced by rigid movements that betrayed his uncertainty. Thomas escorted all parties into the main conference room, seating arranged as I'd specified, Thomas and I on one side, Olivia and her attorney opposite, with Harrison isolated at the end of the table. The physical arrangement reinforced the reality of the situation, Harrison facing opposition from all sides, including his supposed partner. "Thank you all for attending," Thomas began with professional courtesy. "We're here to discuss potential resolution to the contractual matters between Ms. Blackwell and Mr. Reed, specifically regarding the breach of engagement agreements and resulting financial implications." Patricia Alvarez, Olivia's attorney, nodded. "My client is present as an interested party due to certain shared circumstances with Mr. Reed, though she has no direct contractual relationship with Ms. Blackwell." Harrison shifted impatiently. "Can we dispense with the formalities? We all know why we're here. Emma has systematically destroyed my career, frozen my assets, and undermined Olivia's position. All because I chose not to go through with our wedding." "Mr. Reed," Thomas responded calmly, "characterizing the enforcement of contractual provisions as personal retaliation misrepresents the legal reality. The documents you willingly signed established specific consequences for specific actions. Those consequences are now being implemented according to terms you acknowledged and accepted. I never agreed to have my entire life dismantled." "Your exact acknowledgement," Thomas continued, opening a folder, stated that breach of engagement through infidelity or relationship misrepresentation would trigger comprehensive financial reclamation and professional disassociation. You initialed this specific clause on February 12th of last year, after review with independent counsel. He slid a document across the table, the signed acknowledgement, with Harrison's distinctive initials highlighted. "This is legal terrorism," Harrison declared, pushing the document away. "No court would enforce these terms. 3 separate judges have already upheld nearly identical provisions in cases managed by this firm," Thomas countered smoothly, "including Judge Eleanor Harmond, who is currently assigned to your filing should this matter proceed to litigation." At the mention of Judge Harmond, known for her strict enforcement of relationship contracts, Olivia's attorney straightened, clearly recognizing the implication. "Perhaps," Patricia suggested carefully, "we should review the proposed settlement terms before determining whether litigation is necessary." Thomas distributed folders containing the settlement outline. "Ms. Blackwell is prepared to accept these terms as full resolution, provided all parties agree to the specified conditions and timelines." As Harrison and the attorneys reviewed the documents, I maintained my composed silence, observing their reactions. Patricia's slight nod suggested professional recognition of a reasonable, if firm, offer. Harrison's expression darkened as he processed the comprehensive nature of the settlement. The financial penalties, the professional restrictions, the social consequences. "This is extortion," he finally declared, slapping the folder closed. "You're demanding I surrender everything I've worked for and admit wrongdoing just to access my own money." "Mr. Reed," Thomas replied evenly, "the funds in question were either directly provided by Ms. Blackwell during your relationship or earned through opportunities facilitated by Blackwell connections. The settlement allows you to retain approximately 40% of those assets. A generous concession given the documented circumstances of the breach." "And I'm supposed to be grateful? For being allowed to keep scraps while Emma sits in that mansion, pulling strings to destroy anyone who displeases her." I finally spoke, my voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "Harrison, this settlement represents a path forward rather than continued consequences. It acknowledges the reality of your actions while allowing you to rebuild a life independent of Blackwell influence, positive or negative." His eyes fixed on me, a mixture of anger and desperation evident. "You're enjoying this, aren't you? Watching me suffer, seeing everything fall apart." "This isn't about enjoyment. It's about accountability. You made calculated decisions to leverage Blackwell connections while betraying Blackwell trust. Those decisions have consequences. Consequences you were explicitly warned about before you signed the agreements." "And what about Olivia?" he demanded, turning to her. "Are you just going to sit there while she destroys your career too?" Olivia's expression remained carefully neutral, but her response was revealing. "My professional situation is unfortunate, but not insurmountable. I'm exploring options that don't involve continued conflict with the Blackwell family." The implication was clear. Olivia was already separating her future from Harrison's, recognizing that continued association with him represented a liability rather than an asset. Harrison's face flushed with anger and betrayal. "So that's it? Everyone just surrenders to Emma's power play? What happened to standing up for what's right?" Patricia Alvarez intervened with professional calm. "Mr. Reed, from a legal perspective, these settlement terms are significantly more favorable than what might result from protracted litigation. My client recognizes this reality and is approaching the situation pragmatically." "Then your client is a coward," Harrison snapped, standing abruptly. "I won't sign this surrender document. I won't let Emma win just because she has more lawyers and more money." "Harrison," I said quietly, "this isn't about winning. It's about recognizing reality and making decisions accordingly. The consequences you're experiencing aren't arbitrary punishment. They're the direct result of choices you made with full knowledge of potential outcomes. This meeting is a waste of time, he declared, gathering his belongings. I'll see you in court, Emma. Let's see how your perfect plan holds up when the world learns how the Blackwell Empire really operates. As Harrison stormed out, the conference room fell silent. After a moment, Patricia leaned forward. Ms. Blackwell, regardless of Mr. Reed's position, my client wishes to discuss potential resolution regarding her own circumstances. And there it was, the final fracture in Harrison and Olivia's relationship. She was now actively seeking separate settlement, recognizing that her interests no longer aligned with his increasingly self-destructive path. I'm open to that discussion, I replied, meeting Olivia's gaze directly. Though technically, Ms. Westfield has no contractual relationship with me or the Blackwell entities. Nevertheless, Olivia said carefully, certain influences have affected my professional situation. I'm interested in exploring whether those influences might be redirected. Thomas and Patricia exchanged a look of professional understanding. This was now a negotiation between pragmatists rather than a battle of principles. Harrison's emotional exit had only confirmed his inability to recognize the strategic realities that Olivia clearly perceived. The meeting continued for another hour, establishing preliminary terms for Olivia's disassociation from Harrison's conflict. She would provide a sworn statement regarding the timeline of their renewed relationship, confirm Harrison's misrepresentations about our engagement, and maintain strict non-disclosure about all Blackwell-related matters. In exchange, certain professional introductions might become available after a suitable interval, not direct Blackwell assistance, but removal of specific obstacles. As we concluded, Olivia remained behind briefly after Patricia stepped out. He won't accept this, you know, she said quietly. Harrison's convinced himself he's the victim of some grand injustice. He can't see that he created this situation himself. And you? I asked. What do you see? She met my gaze directly, professional ambition momentarily visible beneath her composed exterior. I see that opposing Blackwell interests was a miscalculation. One I don't intend to repeat. With that acknowledgement, Olivia departed, likely to inform Harrison of her separate negotiations, triggering the final crisis in their relationship and the last phase of my strategy. I returned to the estate as dusk settled over Boston, the meeting's outcomes unfolding precisely as I had anticipated. Harrison's emotional exit, Olivia's pragmatic separation of interests, the inevitable fracturing of their relationship under systematic pressure, all proceeding according to the strategy I'd developed months ago. Melanie was waiting in my study, with the evening briefing. Mr. Reed returned to Ms. Westfield's townhouse approximately 40 minutes after the meeting concluded. Security reports indicate a significant verbal altercation occurred. Ms. Westfield left the residence at 5:37 p.m. with an overnight bag. She's currently checked into the Four Seasons under her own name. And Harrison? Still at the townhouse. He's made 17 calls in the past hour, most to financial institutions, 3 to former colleagues at Meridian, and 2 to Preston and Blackwell Investment Group. I raised an eyebrow at this last detail. Preston and Blackwell was one of Boston's most prestigious financial firms, with no connection to Harrison's professional history. Any response from Preston and Blackwell? No returned calls. Their hiring director reports that Mr. Reed left increasingly desperate messages about an urgent need to discuss exclusive investment opportunities. So Harrison was attempting to leverage non-existent insider knowledge about Blackwell operations to secure new employment, a predictable but ultimately futile strategy. Preston and Blackwell's management had close ties to my grandfather. They would never engage with someone making unsubstantiated claims about Blackwell business. Has Thomas received any communication from Harrison since the meeting? No formal response to the settlement offer. However, Mr. Reed sent an email at 6:14 p.m. demanding access to evidence of his alleged contractual violations. This request suggested Harrison was still searching for technical loopholes rather than accepting reality, another miscalculation that would only prolong his difficulties. Any other developments requiring immediate attention? Melanie consulted. Her tablet. The Symphony Board has unanimously approved your expanded funding proposal. The winter fundraiser preparations are proceeding on schedule. And Ms. Westfield's attorney has formally requested a follow-up meeting to discuss her separate settlement terms. Schedule that for tomorrow, 11 a.m. at Thomas's office, and have security increase monitoring of Harrison's movements. His desperation is escalating. We should anticipate increasingly erratic behavior. After Melanie departed, I spent an hour reviewing Blackwell Foundation grant allocations for the coming quarter, maintaining the normal rhythms of responsibility that had always structured my life, regardless of personal circumstances. My grandfather had insisted that true leadership required consistency, especially during periods of conflict or challenge. Rachel called as I was completing the foundation work. "So, Olivia's jumped ship," she said without preamble. Not surprising, but faster than I expected. Harrison's approach at the meeting accelerated her decision, I explained. His emotional outburst confirmed what she already suspected, that he has no viable strategy beyond righteous indignation. "And you're offering her a separate settlement? Is that wise? She's hardly an innocent party in all this." "The settlement acknowledges reality rather than innocence. Olivia participated in Harrison's betrayal, but she's now recognized her error and is acting accordingly. There's no benefit in continuing to apply pressure once the necessary understanding has been achieved." Rachel was silent for a moment. "You know, most people in your position would be focused on emotional vengeance, making both of them suffer equally for the humiliation. But you're systematically separating them, offering Olivia a path forward while maintaining pressure on Harrison. Because their actions, while connected, weren't equivalent," I replied. "Harrison deliberately violated binding agreements while attempting to exploit Blackwell connections. Olivia opportunistically pursued a relationship she believed would advance her interests. Both warrant consequences, but not identical ones. And if Harrison had shown the same recognition of reality that Olivia has, would you be offering him a similar path forward?" I considered this question carefully. Yes, this has never been about punishment for its own sake. It's about establishing appropriate consequences for specific choices, consequences that continue until the necessary understanding is demonstrated. "But you knew Harrison would never choose that path," Rachel observed. "You designed the pressure points knowing exactly how he would respond at each stage, with increasing desperation rather than strategic acceptance." "I designed the consequences. Based on his demonstrated character," I corrected. "Harrison has consistently shown himself to be someone who believes rules apply to others, but not to himself. Who prioritizes appearance over substance. Who views relationships as transactional opportunities rather than commitments. The current situation simply reveals what was always present." After ending the call with Rachel, I spent the evening reviewing security footage from the estate's perimeter cameras. Something about Harrison's increasingly desperate maneuvers suggested he might attempt a direct approach rather than continuing through legal channels. His temperament had always favored dramatic gestures over patient strategy, a fundamental difference between us that he had never fully appreciated. My concerns proved justified shortly after midnight, when security alerts indicated an unauthorized vehicle approaching the estate's service entrance, a less monitored access point primarily used by maintenance staff during daylight hours. The AFI car wasn't Harrison's luxury sedan, but a nondescript rental, though the driver's silhouette was unmistakable. "Maintain surveillance but allow approach," I instructed the night security team. "Full documentation protocol, no direct intervention, unless property damage occurs." Through the security monitors, I watched as Harrison attempted to access the service gate, first trying various numerical combinations on the keypad, then examining the hinges as if considering physical force. His movements were erratic, suggesting possible intoxication or extreme stress. Finally, he resorted to shouting toward the main house, apparently unaware of the comprehensive security systems that had been activated the moment his rental car triggered the perimeter sensors. "Emma, I know you can hear me. This has gone far enough." His voice, captured by directional microphones, was ragged. "You've taken everything from me. My career, my savings, even Olivia. She's talking about separate settlements now. Did you know that? Of course you did. You planned all of this." I observed his breakdown with clinical detachment, noting the progression from angry accusations to increasing desperation. "I just want my life back," he continued, his voice cracking. "The position I earned, the money I worked for. Is that too much to ask? What more do you want from me?" What I wanted was exactly what I'd already clearly outlined: acknowledgement of contractual violations, acceptance of proportionate consequences, and completed separation from all Blackwell connections. Harrison's characterization of his circumstances as arbitrary persecution rather than logical outcomes of his own choices demonstrated that he still hadn't grasped the fundamental reality of his situation. After approximately 20 minutes of increasingly incoherent monologuing, Harrison finally returned to his rental car, but instead of leaving, he simply sat in the driver's seat, head resting against the steering wheel in apparent defeat. I contacted security. If he remains on property for another 30 minutes, have local police conduct a wellness check. Cite concerns about his state and potential self-harm risk. This wasn't merely strategic. Harrison's behavior genuinely suggested someone approaching a breaking point. While I had orchestrated the circumstances revealing his character flaws, I took no pleasure in watching his complete psychological disintegration. Eventually, Harrison started the car and slowly drove away from the estate, his defeated posture visible even through the security cameras. I instructed security to monitor his departure from Blackwell property, but not to track beyond that boundary. His movements beyond my domain were his own responsibility. Morning brought news that Harrison had not returned to Olivia's townhouse, but had checked into the same hotel where he'd previously spent a night, charging the room to yet another credit card that would inevitably be declined. His rental car had been returned to Logan Airport's long-term parking rather than the rental agency, another indication of increasingly disordered thinking. Olivia's separate settlement meeting proceeded as scheduled at Thomas's office. Without Harrison's emotional disruptions, the discussion was brisk and pragmatic, focusing on specific terms rather than perceived grievances. My client is prepared to provide a full statement regarding the timeline of her renewed relationship with Mr. Reed, Patricia Alvarez began, including documentation of his representations about the status of his engagement to Ms. Blackwell. "That would be acceptable," Thomas replied, "provided the statement is comprehensive and verified under oath." Of course, in exchange, Ms. Westfield requests confirmation that certain professional obstacles currently affecting her employment prospects might be reconsidered. The negotiations continued in this vein, detailed, specific, and entirely focused on practical outcomes rather than emotional satisfaction. By the session's end, we had established a framework that acknowledged Olivia's role in the situation while providing a path for her to rebuild her career, independent of Harrison and Blackwell influence. As we concluded, Olivia addressed me directly for the first time since the meeting began. "I want to be clear that I never intended to cause personal hurt," she said, her expression carefully neutral. "My interest in reconnecting with Harrison was based on what I believed was a mutual realization that you two weren't well matched. An assessment conveniently formed after his apparent career advancement," I noted. She had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable. "I accept that. My timing appears opportunistic. However, Harrison was explicit that your relationship had deteriorated long before our reconnection." A narrative that served his purposes while disregarding reality, I replied evenly. But the past is less relevant now than the path forward. The terms we've outlined provide that path, provided all conditions are met fully and promptly. They will be, she assured me. I've learned the value of honoring agreements precisely as written. After Olivia and her attorney departed, Thomas remained behind to discuss next steps regarding Harrison. His midnight appearance at the estate raises security concerns, he noted, reviewing the incident documentation. The behavior suggests escalating desperation rather than rational strategy. Agreed. Increase monitoring but maintain response protocols. Harrison needs to exhaust his misguided resistance before he can truly accept reality. And if that exhaustion takes a concerning turn, his current trajectory suggests potential for self-destructive behavior. I considered this assessment carefully. While I had orchestrated consequences for Harrison's betrayal, I had no desire to push him. Toward genuine harm, justice required proportion. Vengeance often lost sight of that essential balance. If Harrison's behavior indicates actual risk, we'll intervene appropriately, I decided. In the meantime, prepare a modified settlement offer, maintaining the core requirements but extending the implementation timeline. Sometimes the perception of small concessions facilitates acceptance of larger realities. Thomas nodded approvingly. A measured approach. I'll have the revised documents prepared by tomorrow morning. Back at the estate, I spent the afternoon in my greenhouse, a 2-story glass structure my grandmother had commissioned nearly 60 years ago, now maintained as a living memorial to her botanical passion. Tending to the rare orchids and tropical specimens she'd collected from around the world provided a meditative counterbalance to the strategic campaign still unfolding. As I carefully examined a particularly delicate bloom, Melanie appeared at the greenhouse entrance, her expression suggesting urgent developments. Mr. Reed has made contact with the Boston Financial Journal, she reported. He's scheduled an interview for tomorrow morning, apparently planning to discuss predatory practices and hidden operations of the Blackwell family businesses. This represented a significant escalation, a desperate attempt to leverage media attention when legal and personal approaches had failed. It also demonstrated Harrison's continued failure to understand the depth of Blackwell influence throughout Boston's institutions. Contact Charles Bennett at the Journal, I instructed. No direct intervention regarding the interview, but ensure he has complete background on Harrison's terminated position at Meridian, the contractual disputes currently under negotiation, and his unauthorized appearance at the estate last night. Charles Bennett was the Journal's executive editor and a longtime beneficiary of Blackwell Foundation arts patronage. He would understand the context of Harrison's approach without requiring explicit direction. Already addressed, Melanie confirmed. Mr. Bennett has assigned Diane Maxwell to conduct the interview. This was even better than I had hoped. Diane? Maxwell was known for her unflinching investigative approach to financial impropriety. Her recent series on executive misconduct at several major corporations had earned industry awards and ended several careers. If Harrison intended to make unfounded accusations about Blackwell operations, he couldn't have selected a worse interviewer. Perfect. No further action needed regarding the Journal. Has there been any communication from Harrison's previous attorney? Yes. James Donovan called this morning expressing concern about Mr. Reed's mental state based on several rambling messages left at his office. He suggested a welfare check might be appropriate. This independent confirmation of Harrison's deteriorating condition warranted consideration. While his current circumstances were the natural consequences of his own actions, allowing him to spiral into genuine crisis served no strategic purpose. Have Rachel reach out to Harrison? I decided after brief reflection. Not directly as my representative, but as a concerned mutual connection. She should suggest he seek professional counsel, both legal and psychological, before taking any irreversible steps. This measured intervention maintained appropriate boundaries while acknowledging basic human concern. Harrison had betrayed my trust and violated binding agreements, but that didn't eliminate all obligation to prevent genuine harm when possible. Rachel called that evening to report on her conversation with Harrison. "I've never heard him like this," she said, concern evident in her voice. "He's convinced himself he's the victim of some elaborate conspiracy, that you've been secretly controlling his career from the beginning, testing him somehow, and that the canceled wedding triggered some pre-planned punishment protocol. Paranoid ideation rather than acceptance of responsibility," I observed. Not entirely surprising given his character structure, but concerning nonetheless. He mentioned the Financial Journal interview repeatedly, claiming it would expose everything and force you to call off the campaign against him. When I suggested he reconsider that approach, he laughed in this really unnerving way and said, "It was too late for negotiations." Did he appear to understand the potential consequences of making unfounded public allegations? That's just it. He doesn't seem to believe they're unfounded. He's convinced himself he has some kind of insider knowledge about Blackwell operations that would be damaging if revealed. When I pressed him on specifics, though, it was all vague references to conversations he claims to have overheard or documents he glimpsed during your engagement. This delusion wasn't entirely surprising. Harrison had always interpreted limited information through the lens of his own importance, constructing elaborate narratives from minimal data. The stress of recent events had apparently exacerbated this tendency to the point of genuine distortion. "Did you suggest professional support as planned?" I tried. He dismissed the idea completely, said he doesn't need a therapist. He needs justice. "Sorry, Emma. I'm genuinely worried about him. This goes beyond wounded pride or frustrated ambition. He sounds like someone losing touch with reality." After ending the call with Rachel, I contemplated the implications of Harrison's deteriorating mental state. While his current circumstances resulted from his own choices, allowing those consequences to trigger genuine psychological breakdown served neither justice nor strategic interests. I contacted Thomas with revised instructions. Expedite the modified settlement offer. Deliver first thing tomorrow, before the Journal interview. Emphasize that this represents a final opportunity for reasonable resolution. The morning brought news that Harrison had not shown up for his scheduled Financial Journal interview. According to Diane Maxwell's assistant, he had called 30 minutes before the appointment, speaking rapidly about needing more time to gather evidence and promising a bigger story than originally discussed. More concerning was the report from security monitoring. Harrison had been observed purchasing a handgun at a shop in New Hampshire the previous evening, circumventing Massachusetts' stricter firearm regulations. This development changed the FAI risk assessment significantly. While Harrison had shown no direct violent tendencies during our relationship, his increasingly erratic behavior combined with newly acquired means for potential harm warranted immediate response. I convened an emergency meeting with Thomas Wright and the head of Blackwell Security Operations, James Morales, a former military intelligence officer who had overseen estate security for the past decade. "We need to assume Harrison presents a legitimate threat," James advised after reviewing the available information. "The combination of perceived grievance, deteriorating mental state, and newly acquired weapon creates a high-risk profile." "Agreed," Thomas said. "I've already contacted Boston PD regarding his threatening behavior at the estate. They're preparing a welfare check with potential for psychiatric hold evaluation based on the documented pattern of escalation." "And the settlement offer?" I asked. "Delivered to his hotel 30 minutes ago. No response yet." I considered our options carefully. The situation had evolved beyond simple contractual enforcement into genuine security concerns, not only for myself, but potentially for Harrison himself. Implement full protection protocols at the estate and Blackwell Capital offices, I decided. Notify all regular security teams of potential approach or contact. And reach out to Olivia. Harrison may redirect his anger toward her perceived betrayal. James nodded. Already addressed. Ms. Westfield has been notified of potential risk and offered temporary security assistance. And Harrison's current. Location? Unknown at this time. He checked out of the hotel after receiving the settlement documents. His rental car was last tracked heading north on I-93 approximately 40 minutes ago. This information suggested Harrison might be returning to the New Hampshire area where he'd purchased the firearm, possibly to avoid Massachusetts jurisdiction or to access additional resources. Maintain alert status and continue tracking. Attempts, I instructed. But no direct intervention unless clear threat is established. We provide information to appropriate authorities but respect jurisdictional boundaries. As the meeting concluded, Thomas remained behind with a concerned expression. Emma, this situation has evolved beyond contractual enforcement. Harrison's deterioration suggests psychological factors that may render him genuinely dangerous. I'm aware, I acknowledged, which is why we're implementing comprehensive security while facilitating appropriate intervention by authorities. And if those interventions prove insufficient, Harrison seems determined to force some kind of confrontation. Then we respond according to established protocols, protecting people rather than property, involving authorities rather than private resolution, maintaining documentation of all interactions. This isn't the first time Blackwell interests have faced potential threats, Thomas. We have well-established procedures. After Thomas departed, I spent an hour reviewing those very security protocols my grandfather had established decades ago, updated regularly as both threats and protective technologies evolved. The Blackwell family had always understood that wealth and influence occasionally attracted unwanted attention or resentment. Preparation for such contingencies was simply prudent management. Midday brought the first communication from Harrison since he'd received the modified settlement offer. Rather than responding to Thomas directly, he sent an email to my personal account, an address he wasn't supposed to have retained access to after our engagement ended. The message was disjointed, alternating between desperate pleas and thinly veiled threats. Emma, this final offer proves everything I've been saying. You're not interested in fair resolution. You want complete surrender, public humiliation, total control. Well, I won't give you that satisfaction. You've pushed me to the edge, and now you get to see what happens when someone has nothing left to lose. I've documented everything. Every conversation, every coincidence, every suspicious connection between my career setbacks and your family's influences. The journal interview was just a test to see how you'd react. The real evidence is going to multiple sources simultaneously if anything happens to me. There's still time to fix this. Cancel all the legal actions, release my accounts, provide a positive reference to Strategic Ventures for their COO position, and make a public statement that our engagement ended by mutual agreement. Do this by 5 p.m. today, or tomorrow's headline won't be about some minor financial scandal. Last chance, Emma. I never wanted it to come to this, but you've left me no alternative. I forwarded the email to Thomas and James immediately, then called an emergency response meeting. This communication constituted a clear threat requiring coordinated action rather than measured negotiation. The team assembled within 30 minutes. Thomas, James, 2 senior security specialists, and a crisis management consultant who had worked with the Blackwell interests for years. This crosses the line from emotional distress to actionable threat, Thomas confirmed after reviewing the email. I've already filed for an emergency restraining order based on this communication combined with the previous estate incursions. Boston PD has been notified, James added. They've elevated the welfare check to potential threat response. New Hampshire authorities have also been alerted regarding the firearm purchase. What about Harrison's claims of evidence? I asked. Is there any legitimately sensitive information he could potentially possess? James shook his head. Highly unlikely. Our security review confirmed that Mr. Reed never had access to any proprietary Blackwell operations or documentation. Any evidence would be conjecture based on limited observations during your relationship. Nevertheless, the crisis consultant interjected, perception often matters more than reality in these situations. If Mr. Reed believes he has damaging information and is determined to distribute it, we should prepare appropriate responses, regardless of the actual content. I nodded in agreement. Prepare comprehensive response strategies for various scenarios, ranging from personal accusations to business allegations, and increase security monitoring at all Blackwell properties. As the meeting proceeded, Melanie entered with an urgent update. Harrison's rental car has been located at a scenic overlook near Lake Winnipesaukee. Local police are responding, but there's no sign of him at the vehicle. This development raised immediate concerns beyond legal threats or reputation management. A scenic overlook combined with Harrison's documented psychological distress suggested potential self-harm risk. Priority shifts to locating Harrison and ensuring his safety, I decided immediately. Thomas, contact his former attorney and any known associates who might have insight into locations of personal significance. James, coordinate with New Hampshire authorities to establish search parameters. The room mobilized with focused efficiency, personal concerns about Harrison temporarily superseding legal and security considerations. Whatever his threats or accusations, allowing genuine harm to occur contradicted both ethical obligations and strategic interests. For the next 2 hours, we coordinated resources across multiple channels, attempting to locate Harrison before his increasingly unstable state led to irreversible actions. His phone had been turned off or disabled, eliminating the possibility of direct contact or location tracking. Local authorities expanded their search from the overlook to surrounding areas, while we compiled information about Harrison's known connections to the region. Finally, at 3:47 p.m., New Hampshire State Police reported that Harrison had been located at a small cabin belonging to a former college roommate. He had been taken into custody without incident after the property owner reported concerning behavior and awareness of the firearm. A psychiatric evaluation had been ordered based on officers' assessment of his mental state. The relief in the room was palpable. Whatever the complex circumstances that had led to this moment, no one had wished for genuine tragedy. Next steps? Thomas asked, once the immediate crisis had passed. Maintain the restraining order application, I decided after brief consideration. Harrison's actions clearly warrant that protection regardless of his current circumstances. But suspend further legal proceedings regarding the settlement until psychiatric evaluation is complete. His mental state may require treatment before meaningful resolution is possible. And the security protocols? James inquired. Maintain current levels until we have better assessment of the situation. Harrison's detention is temporary. We need to ensure appropriate precautions remain in place regardless of outcome. As the response team dispersed to implement these instructions, I remained in my study, contemplating the unexpected evolution of events. What had begun as appropriate consequences for contractual violations had escalated into a genuine human crisis, not because the consequences themselves were disproportionate, but because Harrison's underlying psychological vulnerabilities had proven more significant than anticipated. Rachel called as evening approached, having been updated on the developments. "This got dark fast," she observed. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I assured her. "The situation is contained, and Harrison is receiving appropriate intervention." "That's not what I asked. This went way beyond contractual enforcement and relationship consequences. Harrison literally threatened you, then ended up in psychiatric custody. That's not the outcome anyone wanted." I considered her perspective thoughtfully. "No, it's not, but it's also not an outcome I created. Harrison made specific choices at every stage, from the initial breach to increasingly desperate attempts to avoid consequences. The current situation reflects those cumulative choices, not some orchestrated punishment." "Maybe," Rachel conceded. But I've known you long enough to recognize when you're being strategically detached rather than actually processing something. This situation evolved beyond your careful planning into genuine human mess. It's okay to acknowledge that. Her observation wasn't inaccurate. I had maintained professional distance throughout the recent developments, focusing on appropriate responses rather than emotional reactions. This approach had served me well in business matters and major decisions, but Rachel was right. Some acknowledgement of the human complexity was warranted. I never wanted Harrison to suffer beyond appropriate consequences, I admitted. His psychological deterioration wasn't part of any strategy, nor was it a desired outcome. If I'd recognized the extent of his vulnerability earlier, perhaps different, approaches would have been implemented. That's my point, Rachel said gently. You designed a perfect strategic response to his betrayal, but humans are messy, complicated, and sometimes fragile in unexpected ways. You couldn't have anticipated this specific outcome. After ending the call with Rachel, I walked through the quiet grandeur of the estate, eventually finding myself in my grandfather's study, a room I'd preserved exactly as he'd left it. The leather-bound books, the antique globe, the chess set perpetually mid-game, all maintained as a physical connection to his wisdom and guidance. Harrison's collapse had indeed fallen outside my carefully constructed strategy. I had anticipated resistance, denial, anger, but not genuine psychological breakdown. The consequences I'd orchestrated were proportionate to his actions and clearly outlined in agreements he'd willingly signed. His inability to accept those consequences reflected deeper issues that predated our relationship. Yet Rachel's point remained valid. Human situations rarely proceeded with strategic perfection, regardless of how carefully planned. My grandfather had emphasized this principle repeatedly during my education. Plans provide direction, he'd often said, but adaptation ensures success. Tomorrow would require significant adaptation. Harrison's psychiatric evaluation would determine immediate next steps regarding his personal situation, while the restraining, order and security protocols would address ongoing safety concerns. The modified settlement offer would remain available once his mental state stabilized, providing a path forward that acknowledged his contractual violations without destroying his ability to rebuild. Olivia's separate resolution would proceed. As negotiated, her pragmatic acceptance of reality allowing for proportional consequences rather than escalating conflict. And I would continue as I always had, managing Blackwell interests with strategic precision, maintaining the family's legacy of consequence and calculation, adapting to changing circumstances while preserving core principles. Justice had been served, though not in the straightforward manner I had envisioned. Harrison had experienced the consequences of his choices, albeit complicated by his own psychological vulnerabilities. The Blackwell name remained protected, its influence undiminished by attempted threats or accusations. Most importantly, I had maintained the balance my grandfather had always emphasized, responding to betrayal with appropriate consequences rather than disproportionate vengeance, seeking resolution rather than destruction, remaining strategic even when circumstances became unexpectedly complex. As night settled over the estate grounds, I returned to my private office to draft instructions for the coming days. Harrison's situation required careful monitoring and appropriate response adjustments. Olivia's settlement implementation needed verification protocols. The Blackwell Foundation's scheduled activities continued regardless of personal developments. Life proceeded, adapting to circumstances while maintaining essential direction, just as my grandfather had taught me, just as the Blackwell legacy demanded. And through it all, I remained exactly who I had always been, not the naive heiress Harrison had assumed, nor the vindictive force he later imagined, but a strategic custodian of inherited responsibility, measured in response, precise, in action, adaptable when necessary. The estate stood silent around me, generations of Blackwell history absorbed into its very walls, a physical manifestation of permanence amid changing circumstances. Harrison had briefly passed through these halls, mistaking invitation for entitlement, opportunity for achievement. His departure, though more dramatic than anticipated, was simply correction rather than tragedy, a necessary realignment of reality according to established principles. Tomorrow would bring new developments, requiring new decisions. But the foundation remained solid, the strategy fundamentally sound. Whatever adaptations proved necessary, the essential balance would be maintained. Justice without cruelty, consequence without destruction, strength without excess. The Blackwell way. My way. The path I had always walked, even when others failed to recognize its true direction. 6 months later, I stood in the greenhouse, carefully tending to my grandmother's prized orchid collection as morning light filtered through the glass ceiling. The estate had settled back into its natural rhythm, the turbulence of Harrison's dramatic exit from my life now a closed chapter rather than an ongoing concern. Thomas entered with his characteristic measured steps, portfolio in hand. The final paperwork has been processed, Emma. Everything is officially resolved. I set down my gardening shears and removed my gloves. Harrison signed the settlement terms without further objection. Yes, his new attorney, appointed by the court following his treatment, was quite reasonable. They recognized the modified offer was more than fair under the circumstances. Harrison had spent 2 months in a private psychiatric facility following his detention in New Hampshire. The evaluation had revealed underlying issues that predated our relationship, narcissistic patterns exacerbated by professional pressure and personal rejection. Treatment had apparently provided sufficient stability for him to finally accept reality rather than continuing his self-destructive resistance. And the conditions? All implemented as specified? Thomas nodded. Full non-disclosure agreement. Executed. Comprehensive release of claims signed. Permanent separation from all Blackwell connections acknowledged. He's relocated to Chicago. Accepted a mid-level position with a regional hospitality group. No executive title. No equity stake. But a fresh start away from Boston. And Olivia? Proceeding precisely according to her separate agreement. She provided the sworn statement regarding timeline and misrepresentations, maintained appropriate confidentiality, and has accepted a position with a financial services firm in San Francisco. No further contact with Mr. Reed reported since his hospitalization. I returned to carefully pruning the delicate white orchid before me, my grandmother's favorite variety, requiring particular attention during seasonal transitions. Then the matter is truly concluded. Thank you, Thomas, for your typically thorough management. He hesitated momentarily. There is one additional item that might interest you. Mr. Reed included a personal letter with the signed documents. I've verified it contains nothing concerning from a legal perspective. This was unexpected. Harrison's communication since his psychiatric intervention had been strictly limited to formal legal channels, with no personal outreach attempted. You've read it? Only to confirm absence of threats or problematic content. The substance remains private. I accepted the sealed envelope Thomas extended, setting it aside rather than opening it immediately. Is there anything else requiring attention today? Nothing urgent. The Blackwell Foundation quarterly review is scheduled for Thursday. The hospital wing dedication remains on the calendar for next month. Otherwise, business proceeds as usual. After Thomas departed, I completed my work in the greenhouse before returning to my study. The letter remained on my desk, representing a final communication from a chapter I had considered definitively closed. Eventually, I opened it, finding 3 handwritten pages in Harrison's distinctive script, steadier than his last frantic email, but still bearing traces of the uncertainty that had replaced his once confident hand. Dear Emma, this letter accompanies my signature on the settlement documents, officially ending all legal matters between us. Before this chapter closes completely, I felt compelled to write what I couldn't say during our relationship, what I couldn't see during its dissolution, and what I've only recently come to understand during my recovery. I betrayed your trust, not just by ending our engagement for Olivia, but by consistently misrepresenting who I was and what I valued throughout our relationship. I presented myself as someone driven by integrity and vision, when in reality, I was motivated primarily by appearance and advantage. I spoke of partnership while thinking of transaction. My therapists have helped me recognize patterns that long predated meeting you, a fundamental insecurity masked by performative confidence, a belief that external achievements could compensate for internal emptiness. These explanations aren't offered as excuses, merely as context for understanding that your actions following our broken engagement weren't the cause of my collapse, but rather the catalyst that revealed what was already unstable within me. What I characterized as cruel manipulation was simply the natural consequence of choices I made with full awareness of potential outcomes. The agreements I signed weren't unfair. They were clear commitments I willingly accepted, then violated when I believed more advantageous options had appeared. I don't expect forgiveness or reconciliation. Those bridges have been thoroughly burned by my actions. I write only to acknowledge truth before moving forward. You were never who I assumed you to be. I constructed a convenient fiction about a naive heiress who needed my guidance, when in reality, you were always the more capable, strategic, and principled person in our relationship. The path forward you've provided through this settlement is more generous than warranted given my behavior. I've accepted it with full understanding of its terms and intentions. You won't hear from me again after this letter, nor will I ever attempt to leverage any connection to the Blackwell name or holdings. I am seeking to build something authentic from the ruins of my former self, something based on actual value creation rather than impression management. Whether I succeed remains to be seen, but the attempt itself represents progress compared to the person you knew. With respect and acknowledgement, Harris and I read the letter twice, then placed it in the file containing all documentation of our concluded relationship. Harrison's belated insight didn't change the past, but it did suggest the consequences had ultimately served their intended purpose, creating understanding rather than merely imposing punishment. The weeks that followed brought a gradual return to normalcy, or rather, to the authentic rhythm of my life that had been temporarily interrupted by Harrison's presence and subsequent departure. The Blackwell Foundation continued its carefully targeted philanthropy. Blackwell Capital maintained its strategic market positions. The family legacy proceeded under my quiet but firm direction. Rachel and I were having lunch at a new bistro overlooking the harbor when she broached the subject that many in our social circle had been carefully avoiding. So, she began with deliberate casualness, Margot Cavendish mentioned that her nephew is returning from London next month. Apparently, he's taking over the family's North American operations. Harvard Business School, impeccable family connections, genuinely interested in sustainable investment practices. I raised an eyebrow. Are you attempting to matchmake, Rachel? Merely mentioning an interesting development, she replied with feigned innocence. Though I will say, 18 months is a respectable mourning period for a relationship that ended before marriage. No one would consider it premature if you began selective socializing again. I appreciate the concern, but I'm not in mourning. I'm simply focused on priorities that don't currently include romantic entanglements. Rachel studied me over her wine glass. Is that because you're genuinely content with solitude, or because Harrison's betrayal confirmed some pre-existing suspicion about relationship reliability? The question deserved honest consideration. My relationship with Harrison had ended not with heartbreak, but with strategic response to contractual violation. The emotional attachment had begun fading long before the official termination, as his true character gradually revealed itself through small but significant choices. Neither, I finally answered. I'm open to genuine connection when it presents itself organically, I'm simply not interested in manufacturing one to meet external expectations about appropriate timelines. Rachel nodded slowly. Fair enough. But promise me one thing. If organic connection does appear, you won't subject the poor man to the same comprehensive background checks, contractual provisions, and strategic evaluations that have become your standard operating procedure. I smiled slightly. I promise appropriate due diligence rather than excessive verification. Some baseline standards remain non-negotiable. I suppose that's as much concession to romantic spontaneity as I can expect from Emma Blackwell, she conceded with a laugh. The truth was more nuanced than I'd expressed. Harrison's betrayal hadn't created mistrust. It had confirmed the wisdom of my grandfather's approach to both business and personal relationships. Clear agreements, appropriate verification, and consequences proportionate to actions. That philosophy had guided Blackwell's success for generations. There was no reason to abandon it based on one predictable disappointment. The following month brought the dedication of the new Blackwell Memorial Wing at Boston Children's Hospital, a project I'd initiated 2 years earlier, now reaching successful completion despite the personal turbulence that had occurred during its development. As I stood at the podium delivering remarks about the Foundation's commitment to accessible healthcare, I caught sight of an unfamiliar face among the hospital board members. A man approximately my age, his attention focused completely on my speech rather than the social networking happening in the periphery. Dr. Abernathy, the hospital director, made introductions during the reception that followed. Emma, I'd like you to meet Dr. Michael Harrington, our new head of pediatric oncology research. He's joining us from Memorial Sloan Kettering and will be overseeing the research initiatives in the new wing. Ms. Blackwell, Dr. Harrington, greeted me with a direct gaze and firm handshake. Your foundation's commitment to research independence is refreshing. Most donors want their names on buildings but maintain subtle influence over research directions. Your grandfather's model of support without interference is unfortunately rare. His comment revealed familiarity with Blackwell Foundation principles, not included in my public remarks. You've researched our philanthropy approach thoroughly, Dr. Harrington. Michael, please. And yes, before accepting the position, I wanted to understand the institutional philosophy. The Blackwell model of long-term stability over quick results aligns with genuine scientific progress. It's partly why I chose Boston Children's over competing offers. Our conversation continued with unexpected ease, touching on research ethics, institutional priorities, and the balance between immediate treatment advances and fundamental understanding. No social posturing, no impression management, simply authentic exchange of perspectives. As the event concluded, Michael handed me his card, a simple professional contact rather than contrived follow-up. The research team is developing several approaches that align with your foundation's stated priorities. When they're ready for review, I'd appreciate your insights beyond just the funding considerations. I'd be interested in that discussion, I replied honestly. As I departed in my car, Rachel, who had observed the exchange from across the room, texted immediately. Organic connection spotted at 4 o'clock. Attractive doctor, intense conversation, actual smile from Emma Blackwell. Investigation pending. I responded with appropriate restraint. Professional conversation about research priorities. Foundation business only. Her reply came instantly. Of course, purely professional, just like every great Boston romance, beginning with discussions of endowment allocation and research ethics. I smiled despite myself. Rachel's teasing wasn't entirely misplaced. The conversation had been surprisingly engaging, free from the calculation that had characterized so many social interactions since Harrison's departure. Whether it developed into anything beyond professional respect remained to be seen, and wasn't, contrary to Rachel's assumption, my immediate priority. Life proceeded according to its own rhythm. The Blackwell estate maintained its quiet grandeur through changing seasons. Blackwell Capital continued its strategic market positioning. The foundation expanded its carefully targeted philanthropy. And I continued as I always had, guided by principles established across generations, adapted to present circumstances, focused on long-term stability rather than immediate advantage. Harrison's chapter had closed completely, its lessons integrated rather than discarded. Olivia's separate path had diverged permanently, her pragmatic adaptation representing its own form of understanding. The consequences I'd orchestrated had served their purpose, not revenge for its own sake, but appropriate response to specific choices. Whatever came next would build upon that foundation of clarity about who I was, what I valued, and how I responded when those values were challenged. Not the naive heiress Harrison had imagined, nor the vengeful manipulator he later feared, but exactly who I had always been. A Blackwell in both name and nature, strategic without cruelty, powerful without excess, and always, fundamentally, guided by principles rather than mere advantage. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.